It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where people step out of their homes expecting routine, not a lifetime of illusions shattering at once. Yet there he was, Alistair Kincaid, 75 years old, hands trembling as officers closed metal around his wrists. A man the entire town once praised, trusted, admired, now being walked down the steps of City Hall like a criminal who'd finally run out of places to hide. People stood frozen on the sidewalk. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered prayers. A few simply stared, unable to reconcile the man they believed in with the truth unfolding right in front of them. And in that moment, an entire community realized that the nightmare they'd spent 50 years avoiding wasn't a ghost story, it was walking among them the whole time. Parents pulled their children close. Elderly residents shook their heads in disbelief. Someone shouted, "There must be a mistake." But deep down, even those who wanted to deny it could feel the truth pressing on their chests like weight they'd carried for decades without knowing why. Because if he could hide something this monstrous for half a century, if a man wrapped in respectability could walk freely for 50 years after taking a young woman's life, if a killer could blend into their church pews, their board meetings, their community events, then the question wasn't how. It was, how many signs did we ignore? Don't miss cases like this. Subscribe to stay alert. Comment ready if you want the truth revealed. If tragedies like this catch people off guard, imagine being uninformed. Subscribe now. And before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to connect with you. If you enjoy stories that expose hidden truths, hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to hear it too. For decades, people in Colombia spoke Alistair Kincaid's name with admiration. They invited him to community boards, honored him at local gatherings, praised his quiet manners and polished presence. He was the man they pointed to when they wanted to remind their children that good people still existed in the world. But on the day of his arrest, that carefully built image collapsed like a cheap mask soaked in rain. Residents watched him being escorted toward the patrol car, and something inside them snapped, not confusion, not disbelief, but anger. Cold, bitter anger that tasted like regret and burned like shame. Because this wasn't just the arrest of an older man, this was the collapse of a lie the entire community had swallowed willingly. All the years of rumors, all the unanswered questions, all the uneasy glances that people dismissed because they didn't want to believe a respected man could hold so much darkness inside him. People remembered moments that felt off. Times when Kincaid stood too close. Times when his compliments stretched too long. Times when he appeared unexpectedly at places that had no connection to him. And now, as he was placed inside the back of the police car, those buried memories hit the townspeople with the force of a storm they'd pretended wasn't coming. Some whispered, "How did we not see it?" Others murmured, "What else did he hide?" But the truth was simple and brutal. The community didn't miss the signs, they avoided them. They trusted the image more than the instincts. And now they were paying the price of that silent choice. Don't miss cases like this. Subscribe to stay alert. Comment ready if you want the truth revealed. Long before Alistair Kincaid's wrists were locked in steel, before the town erupted in disbelief and outrage, Colombia had already survived a night that left a mark no one dared acknowledge. The year was 1973, humid evenings, crowded front porches, and a community so trusting it never imagined danger could walk the same streets their children played on. Yet danger didn't always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes it wore a familiar face. That April night felt ordinary at first. Street lamps hummed over quiet sidewalks. A faint breeze carried the scent of baked goods from the tiny bakery on Main Street. People moved through their routines with the confidence of a town that believed harm needed an invitation to enter. But what happened that night would break that illusion forever. While most residents settled in for the evening, Maren Ellison, just 24, stepped out of a poetry gathering with a gentle smile and her notebook tucked under her arm. A young woman with a warm laugh and a glow that made people feel lighter simply by being near her. She wasn't meant to disappear. She wasn't meant to become a cold case legend. She wasn't meant to become the town's deepest regret. Her walk home was barely 4 blocks a path she'd taken countless times without a hint of fear. A route she trusted because she trusted her community. A community that would later realize that trust was the very thing that made her vulnerable. As Maren turned down the narrow stretch leading toward her apartment, the quiet around her shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but just enough to unsettle anyone paying attention. Except she wasn't paying attention. Why would she? Nothing in her world had ever taught her to be afraid of the shadows she knew so well. What she didn't know was that someone was watching, someone who shouldn't have been there, someone the town would spend 50 years pretending wasn't capable of harm. And with that final step toward home, Maren walked straight toward a fate Columbia would spend half a century trying to understand. Before Maren Ellison became the name whispered in fear, printed on fading posters, and etched into the town's guilt, she was simply a young woman with light in her eyes and hope stitched into every dream she carried. 24 years old, fresh out of Vanderbilt, and determined to leave her mark on the world not through fame, not through fortune, but through words, honesty, and a gentle spirit that made people around her feel seen. She had a laugh that softened the edges of a hard day, a habit of humming when she edited manuscripts, a warmth that made even strangers feel familiar. People described her as the type of person who remembered small details about you: your birthday, your favorite snack, the exact way you took your coffee, and made you feel like those details mattered. Her co-workers adored her. Neighbors often said she was the kind of girl who made this town feel alive. Her parents spoke of her as a gift, a bright spot in a world that often felt heavy. And her best friend Valerie swore Maren had a way of walking into a room and shifting its energy without even trying. Maren had dreams that stretched far beyond the publishing house where she worked as an assistant. She wanted to write her own book one day, a collection of stories that highlighted ordinary people and the extraordinary things they survived. Her notebook was always with her, margin scribbles, ideas circled, quotes marked with tiny stars. She was loved. She was valued. She was the kind of woman the world should have protected. But the world failed her. And on the night she disappeared, that bright spark, the one so many people relied on, was still glowing. Unaware that someone had already decided her light didn't deserve to shine any longer. The community center that evening was filled with soft chatter, mismatched chairs, and the comforting sound of pages turning. Maren loved nights like this, small gatherings where creativity felt personal, not performative. She had attended dozens of these sessions, always sitting close enough to the front to hear every word, but not so close that she drew attention. She never wanted the spotlight. She simply wanted to feel connected to something meaningful. People who saw her that night remembered the same thing: her smile. Not a loud smile. Not a showy one, but something gentle, easy, and genuine. She laughed softly at a friend's joke. She complimented a stranger's poem. She wrote 2 short lines in her notebook during a reading, circling them twice. Those would become the last words she ever wrote. A few attendees recalled seeing her step outside around 11:30 p.m. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But one person, a young man sitting near the back, later mentioned noticing a figure leaning against a lamppost across the street. He couldn't describe the face or the height clearly, but he remembered the feeling the moment gave him. Something was off. Something didn't match the simple calm of the evening. His comment was brushed aside. No one wanted to attach doubt or fear to a night that felt so peaceful. Probably someone waiting for a ride, a woman said. And that was that. The detail slipped through the cracks and was forgotten almost as soon as it was spoken. People waved as Maren walked out the door. A few exchanged good nights. Someone joked, "Don't stay up too late editing," and she laughed, promising she wouldn't. But as she walked into the dim streetlight outside, her smile faded into the quiet, and whatever watched her from the distance didn't fade at all. It waited, and it followed. Maren's walk home usually felt comforting, a quiet routine that marked the end of a long day and the beginning of peaceful hours spent reading or editing in her small apartment above the bakery. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving patches of dimness between the pools of light, but she'd never feared them. Not once. Those 4 blocks were familiar to her, almost like an extension of her own home. She stepped onto the sidewalk, notebook tucked close to her side, the faint scent of bread drifting through the cool night air. Her shoes clicked softly against the pavement. The town felt still, almost sleepy, as though nothing truly terrible could ever happen within its borders. But that night, The quiet felt heavier. A car door somewhere in the distance shut a little too slowly. A shape shifted near the corner. A shadow lingered longer than usual before fading behind a row of parked vehicles. Small moments that should have meant nothing, but together formed a pattern she didn't recognize, not because she wasn't aware, but because she trusted her surroundings far more than she should have. As she passed the second block, she paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. Something made her look, not fear, not alarm, just a flicker of instinct. She saw nothing. The street behind her was empty, unmoving, silent, but the feeling didn't leave. It simply settled deeper into the quiet. A single figure stood several yards away, hidden just enough that she couldn't see him even if she tried. He watched her steps. He watched her pace. He watched the way she tucked her hair behind her ear as she approached the narrow path leading toward her building. Those 4 blocks should have taken 3 minutes. Instead, each second became a countdown she didn't know she was racing against. If her final steps disturb you, stick with us till the end. Maren turned into the alley near her apartment, unaware that someone stepped forward from the shadows, following without hesitation. Valerie Sinclair wasn't supposed to be home that morning. Her trip to visit family was meant to last 3 more days, but something gnawed at her the entire night, an uneasiness she couldn't shake, the kind that wakes you up before dawn and refuses to let you go back to sleep. She caught the first bus back to Columbia, trying to convince herself she was overthinking. Maren always answered her calls. Always. But this time, every ring felt like a warning. When Valerie reached their apartment building, she paused at the base of the steps. Nothing looked unusual. The bakery downstairs was already open, the familiar scent drifting upward. Birds chirped. Doors opened and closed along the street. To anyone else, the morning felt normal. But not to her. She climbed the stairs slowly, each footstep heavier than the last. The closer she got to their door, the tighter her chest felt. Something wasn't right. She didn't know why, she couldn't explain it, but the silence behind the door felt wrong. Not peaceful, not empty, just wrong. She unlocked the door, pushing it open with the smallest effort. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt still in a way she'd never felt before. The apartment wasn't messy. It wasn't disturbed. Nothing was out of place. And yet Valerie felt an immediate, bone-deep certainty that something terrible had happened here. "Maren?" she called out softly. No answer. Her voice echoed faintly through the hall, bouncing off the walls like it didn't belong there. The kitchen counter was spotless. The armchair by the window sat untouched. Everything sat where it always sat. But that stillness, that quiet, it wasn't normal. It was the quiet left behind when someone leaves without planning to. Valerie swallowed hard and stepped further inside, unaware that she had just walked into the aftermath of a moment that changed everything. Valerie moved deeper into the apartment, every step tightening the knot in her stomach. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing looked touched. But that was the problem. Everything looked too untouched, too still, too arranged. As if the room was waiting for someone who had no chance of returning. Her eyes landed first on the armchair. Maren's dress, the one she wore to the poetry reading, lay neatly folded on top of it. Not draped. Not tossed aside like she usually did after a long night. Folded. Straight. Perfect. Valerie blinked, trying to make sense of it. Maren never folded clothes after coming home late. She barely remembered to hang her keys half the time. Valerie moved to the kitchen next. The purse sat right on the counter. Open slightly, but everything inside untouched: wallet, ID, lipstick, a crisp $5 bill she always kept tucked behind her cards. Why would she leave everything behind? Why walk home so carefully only to abandon the essentials she carried everywhere? Her breath caught when she looked out the window. Maren's car sat in its usual spot behind the building, not moved, not disturbed. Another sign that she hadn't planned to go anywhere. People don't walk away from their lives in the middle of the night wearing the same clothes they went out in, leaving everything they own neatly in place. People don't fold dresses unless they plan to come back, and Maren would never leave without telling Valerie. Never. Valerie stepped back from the counter, heart pounding harder now. The apartment wasn't chaotic like a struggle had happened, but it wasn't calm either. It felt arranged, controlled, and that was worse. Something or someone had made sure the room looked untouched. But why? Why was the apartment staged as if she'd return? What did the person who took her understand about her habits? Valerie didn't have the answers yet, but she could feel the truth closing in on her, breath by breath. Valerie forced herself to walk deeper into the apartment, each step louder in her ears than the last. She scanned every corner, searching for something, anything that would explain why her best friend hadn't shown up for work, hadn't answered her calls, hadn't left a single sign of where she went or who she was with. Her pulse hammered as she moved toward Maren's bedroom. The door was slightly open. Not wide enough to suggest panic, not tight enough to imply privacy, just open enough to say someone had been there. Valerie felt her hands tremble as she pushed the door wider. The room was spotless. The bed was made, the blanket smoothed. A book lay face down on the nightstand as though paused mid-sentence. Her glasses were folded neatly beside it, an arrangement too perfect to make sense for someone who often rushed through her evenings, forgetting to tidy up before falling asleep. But the detail that made Valerie's breath stop wasn't in the bedroom. It was in the hallway. She turned back toward the armchair, her eyes locking onto the dress again. Not the fact that it was folded, she'd already wrestled with that. It was how it was folded. Too exact, too formal. A fold that didn't belong to someone coming home tired after a long night. A fold that didn't belong to Maren at all. Valerie stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the fabric. It wasn't just placed there. It was arranged. Someone had been in the apartment. Someone who wanted the scene to look peaceful. Someone who knew Maren's routines well enough to mimic normalcy, but not well enough to get the small details right. Her breath shook. This wasn't a runaway. This wasn't confusion. This was someone shutting a door behind a crime and hoping no one would notice it didn't close naturally. What would you feel walking into this scene? Comment below. Valerie stared at the dress again, that wrong, perfect fold, and for the first time, fear settled in her bones like truth. When Maren Ellison was reported missing, the people who should have moved fastest were the ones who shrugged the earliest. Valerie was still shaken, her voice cracking as she begged the Columbia Police Department to take her fears seriously. Maren's parents arrived within hours, frantic, desperate, pleading with anyone who would listen. But instead of urgency, they were met with indifference wrapped in polite smiles. Chief Sterling Hawthorne, the man who held absolute authority over the town's safety, leaned back in his chair, hands folded, expression relaxed, as if a 4-year-old woman vanishing overnight wasn't cause for alarm, as if parents choking back tears were simply overreacting. Maybe she went off with someone, he said. Maybe she needed space. Young women do unpredictable things. Every word hit like a slap. Beatrice Ellison begged him to check the apartment again. Owen Ellison pleaded for officers to canvass the street. Valerie insisted that Maren never disappeared without a word. But the chief dismissed all three of them, choosing the easiest explanation he could reach, one that required no action, no investigation, and no responsibility. The hours that mattered most, the first 24, were wasted. No roadblocks, no searches, no alerts, no urgency. Because Hawthorne believed nothing had happened. That casual assumption, that lazy, catastrophic decision, closed the door on the only chance Maren had for immediate justice. Had the department acted, they might have caught the trail while it was fresh. They might have noticed something off. They might have asked the right questions. Instead, they told the family to wait. Wait for what? For Maren to magically walk back through the door? For time to erase the town's responsibility? For guilt to someday feel lighter? That day, the system didn't just fail Maren. It abandoned her before the search even began. By the time officers finally entered Maren's apartment, the investigation had already drifted in the wrong direction. Instead of studying the scene with urgency, they made assumptions that shaped everything that followed. They glanced around the room, saw no signs of chaos, and decided it wasn't the work of someone dangerous. As if danger always announces itself with broken furniture and blood. They noticed her purse on the counter untouched, yet still clung to the theory that Maren walked out on her own. They logged the folded dress in passing, writing it off as neatly placed clothing, never questioning why a woman returning home late at night would suddenly become tidy enough to fold an outfit she'd worn for hours. The kind of detail that should have raised every alarm was brushed off like background noise. Then came the theories. Some officers insisted she'd gone off with a secret boyfriend. Others whispered about stress, claiming she might have wanted a break from responsibilities. Hawthorne encouraged these ideas, not because they were logical but because they were easy, convenient, requiring nothing but time. Meanwhile, actual clues sat in plain sight. People living along Maren's route reported seeing another figure walking behind her the night she disappeared, a detail written down but ignored. One woman described hearing hurried footsteps. Another remembered a car circling the block more than once. Yet none of this mattered to investigators who were already convinced nothing bad had happened. The town mirrored the department's attitude. Neighbors convinced themselves that Maren was simply taking time away. Rumors spread faster than facts. And with every careless guess, every dismissive statement, every blind assumption, the truth slipped further out of reach. The worst part? This wasn't a lack of evidence. It was a lack of effort. A community that should have stood united for Maren instead drowned her story in noise. And behind that noise stood the real culprit, someone counting on the town to look the wrong way. When investigators finally started documenting items from Maren's apartment, one detail stood out, or at least, it should have. A silver locket sat near the edge of her bedroom drawer. The chain snapped clean through. Maren wore it every day. She never took it off. Anyone who knew her would have said the same. But instead of treating it like a potential sign of a struggle, officers wrote it off as damaged jewelry. A piece that could have said everything was treated like it meant nothing. Had anyone paused to consider it, the broken chain alone could have shifted the investigation. It could have pointed toward physical contact. It could have forced the officers to admit that something violent may have happened. But bias, the same bias that told them young women take off sometimes, blinded them to the meaning behind an object that practically screamed for attention. And the bias didn't stop there. The department focused on the wrong person entirely. Orrin Keller, a quiet repairman who happened to live nearby, became their convenient target. Not because evidence led to him, but because he was single, shy, and kept to himself. In the eyes of the department, that made him suspicious enough. Meanwhile, the real threat, someone respected, familiar, trusted, lived his life unbothered, confident the town would never question him. While officers badgered an innocent man, the silver locket sat in an evidence bag, half forgotten. No fingerprints lifted, no follow-up questions, no urgency. A chain that could have broken their assumptions instead gathered dust. And cases fail exactly like this, through laziness disguised as logic. Cases fail when details are ignored. Subscribe, so we keep exposing them. The Ellisons were left with empty reassurances. Valerie was left with unanswered questions. And the department, instead of admitting the truth, moved on as if their mistakes weren't burying a young woman's life. Then, as they wrapped the initial investigation, one officer paused at the doorway, glancing back toward the drawer where the locket had been found. Something about that broken chain stuck with him, but he said nothing. In the weeks following Maren Ellison's disappearance, Columbia changed in ways no one expected. A town once known for warm greetings and unlocked doors suddenly felt cold, guarded, and suspicious. Parents kept their children close. Shop owners closed earlier. Porch conversations grew shorter. Every shadow on the sidewalk felt like a warning. Curfews spread through neighborhoods without anyone needing to enforce them. Lights went off early. People walked faster, kept their heads down, avoided eye contact. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it, the creeping fear that whatever had happened to Maren could happen again. And because fear seeks answers, even bad ones, neighbors began turning their suspicions toward anyone who didn't fit their comfort zone. Outsiders passing through town drew long stares. Travelers felt unwelcome. Someone with a different accent or unfamiliar face instantly became a topic of hushed conversation. People weren't looking for a culprit anymore. They were looking for someone to blame. Rumors spread like wildfire. A new arrival renting a room on Pine Street suddenly found himself under watch. A pair of teenagers who liked walking late at night drew side-eye from older residents. Even longtime locals weren't safe from assumptions. Fear had wiped away memory, trust, and logic. Church groups hosted emergency meetings. Neighborhood associations circulated warnings. Folks who had known each other for decades treated one another like potential threats. Columbia wasn't just becoming fearful, it was devouring itself from the inside. The bitter truth? The town wasn't protecting itself. It was tearing itself apart. Instead of directing its energy toward finding the person responsible, Columbia turned its attention toward easy targets: strangers, passers-by, and anyone who fit the image of someone dangerous, even when evidence said otherwise. And while the town chased shadows, the real threat walked among them without a single person daring to look his way. If the town's fear was a spark, the Columbia Chronicle turned it into a wildfire. The paper didn't just report on Maren's disappearance, it magnified every whisper, every rumor, every anxious thought ricocheting through the community. Headlines grew bolder each day, written less to inform and more to rile. Is a predator moving through our streets? Out-of-town stranger seen days before Maren Ellison vanished. Are we safe anymore? None of these statements were backed by proof. But fear doesn't need proof, it just needs a platform, and the paper gave it one. Articles didn't focus on the weak investigation. They didn't question the delays, the missing procedures, or the ignored evidence. Instead, the Chronicle leaned into the idea that the threat came from elsewhere, pushing the comforting but destructive belief that the town itself was innocent, that danger had come from beyond its borders. People devoured these stories, letting them feed their fears. The newspaper painted travelers as threats. It described passing construction crews as suspicious. It turned a random hitchhiker into a mystery man who could be connected. No matter how thin the details, the Chronicle shaped them into compelling stories that pushed the community deeper into panic. Meanwhile, the real question, the one that should have been printed in bold ink across the front page, went unanswered. What overlooked detail should have redirected the investigation? Instead of asking why the locket chain was broken, instead of asking why Maren's dress was folded with unusual care, instead of asking why her final walk went unexamined, the paper told readers what they wanted to hear: that the danger was someone unknown. Someone passing through. Someone we don't have to look in the eye on Sundays. It was easier to fear a stranger than to question a neighbor. And while the town fixated on outsiders, the true danger blended effortlessly into the daily rhythm of Columbia, unnoticed, unchallenged, untouched by suspicion. Fear has a way of blinding people, and in 1973, Columbia chose blindness over honesty. Instead of looking inward, instead of asking whether someone among them was capable of harming a young woman, the community clung to the story that felt safest, that the threat came from the outside. A stranger, a drifter, someone passing through, someone they didn't have to acknowledge as one of their own. It was a comforting lie, and they embraced it fully. Residents convinced themselves that Maren had been targeted by someone who didn't belong. They repeated the Chronicle's claims as if they were facts. They nodded along to theories that lacked logic but offered emotional relief, and the more they believed it, the less they questioned what lay in front of them. What overlooked detail should have redirected the investigation? All they had to do was pay attention to the simple inconsistencies: the folded dress, the broken locket, the untouched purse. Clues that pointed not to a random attacker, but to someone familiar with Maren's life. Someone who knew her patterns. Someone who could move within her space without forcing entry. But the outsider narrative was easier. Cleaner. Less painful. Why did townspeople prefer the outsider story? Because it allowed them to protect their image. Because it kept the illusion of safety intact. Because accepting the alternative, that someone respected, known, and trusted was responsible, would force the town to confront its own failures. So Columbia kept looking outward, and the truth stayed buried. By the time the hysteria settled, valuable evidence sat in boxes, mislabeled and forgotten. A hair sample placed in an envelope marked simply "Misk." A set of early photographs filed away. Notes, scribbled by an officer who doubted the runaway theory but said nothing publicly. Evidence that could have broken the case wide open. Evidence that waited 45 years for someone to care enough to open the right drawer. Guilty or not guilty, did the town sabotage itself? When officers finally returned to the apartment with the intention of collecting evidence, it was already clear they weren't taking the case seriously. They moved through the space like men checking off boxes on a form rather than searching for signs of a crime. Their actions felt routine, detached, almost mechanical, and that approach shaped the damage that followed. One officer spotted a single hair on the collar of Maren's coat. It didn't match her color, her texture, or anything she normally shed on her clothes. It was the kind of detail that should have triggered immediate questions, But instead of treating it as a lead, he slipped it into a small envelope and wrote one careless word across the top: MISC. Not potential suspect hair. Not foreign sample. Just MISC. A clue that could have broken the case early was downgraded to the same category as dust or lint. Nearby, they noticed a boot print near the back entrance of the building, an impression left in soft soil after the rain. It was deep, clear, distinct. The shape and pattern were visible enough to be analyzed, even in 1973. And yet, instead of casting it, they only photographed it from one angle, then walked away without measuring the tread or locating matching footwear. A clue that could have pointed straight to the person responsible was treated like background scenery. No one asked who had access to the yard that night. No one considered whether the print matched anyone known to Maren. No one even bothered to secure the area before heavy rain washed everything away. The investigation didn't fail because evidence was missing. It failed because the evidence was there and they didn't bother to understand it. A hair. A boot print. Two pieces of a truth waiting to be acknowledged. But the people responsible for finding answers ignored both, leaving the case to rot in a file that would gather dust for almost 50 years. The shocking thing about the evidence in Maren's case isn't that it was lost, it's that it was ignored while sitting right in front of everyone. The hair sample placed in the MISC envelope should have been a turning point. Even in 1973, investigators understood the importance of foreign hair. It could indicate a struggle, unwanted contact, or the presence of someone who had no reason to be near the victim. But because the officers clung to the runaway theory, the hair meant nothing to them. They convinced themselves it belonged to a friend, a co-worker, or maybe even to Valerie. They created explanations instead of asking questions. If anyone had paused to examine the strand more closely, they would have seen that it didn't match Maren in any way, not in length, not in color, not in texture. It didn't belong in her apartment, and it certainly didn't belong on her coat, yet this wasn't enough to spark curiosity. The boot print should have raised even more suspicion. The tread pattern wasn't common. It had a distinctive angled design usually found on outdoor hiking boots, boots rarely worn in that neighborhood. Photographs showed a clear impression with an identifiable pattern, something any halfway attentive department would have traced by asking local stores or comparing footwear worn by acquaintances. Instead, they treated it like an accident, something irrelevant, something that would complicate their narrative. What would they have discovered if they'd examined the tread more carefully? Why did they ignore such a crucial detail when panic was already spreading through town? The truth is simple. They didn't want to believe the danger was familiar. They didn't want to believe the culprit could be someone who attended the same community events, bought groceries at the same corner store, or waved to them from across the street. So the clues sat silently, waiting for a future that would finally give them a voice. When the initial investigation fizzled out, the remaining evidence was gathered without ceremony, not with care, not with urgency, but with the kind of mechanical routine reserved for paperwork no one expects to matter. The hair sample, sealed inside an envelope marked MISC, the boot print photos, tucked into a thin folder, a few scattered notes from patrol officers who had doubts they never voiced loudly enough, all of it placed into a cardboard archive box. No spotlight, no follow-up, no anticipation that these items held the answers everyone claimed didn't exist. The limitations of 1,973 forensics weren't the real issue. The mindset of the department was. Even with basic tools, the evidence could have carried weight. Hair analysis existed. Footwear comparison existed. Logical questioning existed. But without the will to use them, the box became nothing more than a container for missed chances. As months passed, the box slid deeper onto the archive shelves. New cases overshadowed it. Staff changes buried it further. The runaway theory, the one that never made sense, became the story people quietly accepted. The truth sat quietly inside a storage room where the lights rarely flickered on. Years turned into decades. Decades turned into silence. Silence turned into forgetting. But inside that box, the hair waited. The boot print photos waited. They didn't lose their meaning. They didn't lose their value. They simply waited for someone who cared enough to look. Someone who wouldn't accept excuses. Someone who wouldn't believe convenient stories. Someone who understood that evidence only speaks when people listen. Most people never see evidence like this, don't miss what it reveals next. And so, sealed away inside a drawer no one touched, the crucial strand of hair rested in the dark, the single piece of biological truth connecting Maren to the person who walked her into danger on that April night. The box sat untouched for almost 50 years, until the right eyes finally opened it. The moment the investigation officially paused, something inside the Ellison family broke in a way that never healed. It happened quietly, almost casually, a short announcement, a typed memo, a polite explanation that there were no further leads to pursue. There was no ceremony, no final meeting, and no chance for the family to plead one last time. The case was simply set aside, pushed into the same category as unsolved petty thefts and forgotten reports. For the Ellisons, it felt like the world had ended. Beatrice Ellison sat across from the officers that day, gripping her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Owen tried to hold himself together, but his voice cracked when he asked one simple question. "So that's it?" The officer looked down, unable to meet his eyes, and offered nothing more than a rehearsed explanation about limited resources. Valerie was there too, sitting in the corner, barely holding herself upright. She had been the one who first realized something was wrong. She had begged them to treat the disappearance seriously. Now she watched the people responsible for finding Maren shrug off their responsibility like it was a mild inconvenience. The worst part wasn't the decision itself, it was the tone behind it. There was no urgency, no heartbreak, no sense of duty, just quiet resignation, as if Maren's life were a puzzle too difficult to finish, and therefore, not worth the effort. That day, something shifted in Colombia. The police stepped back. The search teams dissolved. The phone calls slowed. And the family who loved Maren more than anything in the world was left standing alone with nothing but silence where answers should have been. The case didn't go cold. It was pushed there, not by time, not by lack of evidence, but by a system that chose convenience over truth. And for the Ellisons, that abandonment became a wound that time refused to heal. In the months after the investigation was shelved, Colombia's energy shifted from anxious to avoidant. The town that once buzzed with fear slowly settled into something colder, a collective decision to forget. At first, people still talked about Maren in nervous whispers. They asked questions in grocery store aisles. They brought up theories during late-night porch conversations. But as weeks blurred into months, those conversations thinned. The posters that once covered every billboard and corner pole began to curl at the edges. Rain washed out the ink. Sunlight bleached the colors. Eventually they became part of the scenery, fading reminders of a story people no longer wanted to confront. Businesses stopped keeping the flyers on their counters. Schools stopped mentioning her name. Even neighbors who once checked in on the Ellisons started offering tight smiles instead of real concern. Colombia chose comfort over truth. Why did the town want to bury this story? Because admitting the truth meant acknowledging how deeply they had failed her. How quickly they let fear steer them in the wrong direction. How willingly they believed easy explanations instead of facing harder questions. Forgetting was easier than facing guilt. Who benefited from forgetting Maren? Not the Ellisons, they suffered for decades. Not Valerie, she carried the weight every day. Not the community, they lived under a false sense of security. The only person who gained anything from silence was the one who hurt her. The one who walked freely through Colombia while everyone looked the other way. The person whose name never once came up in the whispers that filled the town. The truth sat quiet, and the community allowed it. Before long, Maren's story became a subject that made people uncomfortable, something they avoided discussing, something they'd rather rewrite than confront head-on. And with every uncomfortable glance, every changed subject, every faded poster, Colombia erased her a little more. Until eventually, it was like she had never been there at all. As the years stretched forward, the weight of the unanswered questions settled over the Ellison family like a permanent shadow. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed with empty chairs that no one dared move. Every new year felt like a reminder that the world kept going while their daughter remained frozen in the night she vanished. Beatrice kept Maren's room exactly as it was. She dusted it every week, careful with every item, holding on to the faint hope that one day Maren might walk back through the door. Owen grew quieter. his once steady voice thinning out as if grief had hollowed it from the inside. Even Valerie, who visited often, struggled to keep Maren's memory alive in a town that preferred silence over acknowledgement. Time didn't heal anything. It simply widened the distance between the truth and those who needed it most. The town's unwillingness to speak about the case didn't just erase Maren from conversations, it trapped the Ellisons in a painful limbo. Police reports stopped being updated. New officers joining the department rarely even recognized Maren's name. Her file became nothing more than a reference tucked in the back of a cabinet no one opened. Why did the town want so badly to forget her? Who benefited from letting the memory fade? Not the family, not the community. The only person shielded by the silence was the one who caused it. And that silence lasted not just years but decades. People who once promised to stay involved eventually stopped calling. Neighbors who used to check in stopped visiting. Even well-meaning friends gradually shifted their sympathy toward other topics, as if the Ellisons should have moved on by then. But how do you move on from something that never ended? The question isn't just heartbreaking, it's infuriating. Would you forgive a system that failed your family? Comment below. And just when it seemed like the truth would never surface, something unexpected happened. A new unit, a new set of eyes, a new decade. 2018 was about to change everything. By 2018, most people in Colombia barely remembered the details of Maren Ellison's disappearance. The case had melted into the past, hidden behind newer tragedies and fresher headlines. But inside the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Division, a single box worn at the corners, yellowed with age, waited for someone willing to care. Detective Sergeant Pierce Beaumont was that someone. Beaumont wasn't the type to let things slide. He joined the cold case unit for one reason: unresolved crimes haunted him. The idea that a family could spend decades without answers sat on his conscience like a weight he couldn't shake. So when he pulled Maren's file from the archive shelf, he didn't see an old mystery, he saw a failure begging to be corrected. He spread the contents across his desk: faded photographs, typed reports, scribbled notes from officers long retired. It took him minutes, not hours, not days, to notice the gaps that should have raised alarms in 1973. Missing follow-ups, ignored tips, evidence labeled carelessly, statements recorded without detail. The deeper he read, the tighter his jaw became. How had an entire department missed so much? Beaumont scanned the apartment photos. He zoomed in on the dress, the purse, the empty hallway. He read the original report 3 times. Then he leaned back, exhaling slowly, the anger building behind his calm expression. This wasn't just an old case. This was neglect, plain and simple. And he wasn't about to let it stay buried. As he turned another page, something small slipped from between 2 reports, the original list of evidence collected from the apartment. There it was, an envelope marked MISC. Beaumont stared at the word, stunned, a hair sample tossed under a label that meant nothing. His frustration sharpened into resolve. If this tiny detail was real, then the truth might still be hiding in that box, waiting for someone willing to dig. Beaumont was done reading. It was time to check the evidence himself. Beaumont didn't waste time. The moment he opened the archive box, the smell of old paper and forgotten work hit him. Decades of neglect had settled over the documents, but that only sharpened his focus. He wasn't looking for drama, he was looking for mistakes, and they were everywhere. He studied the scene photographs first. Each image held details the original investigators ignored. The folded dress, placed too neatly, the purse untouched, the absence of forced entry. These were signs of control, not chaos, the kind of indicators that point toward someone familiar with the victim, someone who knew the apartment well enough to move comfortably inside it. Yet none of this had sparked alarm in 1973. Beaumont flipped through the interviews next. Vague descriptions, missing timestamps, half-written statements. A neighbor mentioned hearing footsteps around the time Maren walked home. An officer wrote it down, but never followed up. Another neighbor described a man standing near the alley that night. No one bothered to ask who he was or why he was there. The oversight was glaring. What crucial detail could they have uncovered if they'd taken those statements seriously? Beaumont highlighted passages, making margin notes. He circled names. He underlined inconsistencies. Everything screamed for deeper investigation, and instead, The original department had treated the case like a puzzle missing too many pieces. Why did no one question the items labeled MISC, especially the hair sample? He found the boot print photos next, one angle, poor lighting, no measurements, no casting. The tread pattern was clear, distinctive, angular, uncommon, yet the officers hadn't bothered to track down who in town owned boots like that. Beaumont closed his eyes for a moment, steadying the frustration burning through him. These weren't small errors. These were decisions made because the case was inconvenient, messy, and easier to dismiss than pursue. He turned back to the evidence log, jaw tightening. If there was even a chance the original samples still existed, he was going to find them. And if they held answers, he wasn't letting them slip away again. Beaumont's search through the evidence room wasn't quick. Cabinets squeaked, drawers stuck, labels peeled with age, but he didn't stop. He checked every shelf, every row, every unlabeled container, refusing to let the past stay hidden any longer. Then, in a drawer filled with cases even older than Maren's, he found it. A thin cardboard box marked with a fading number, 73E41. Maren's case file. He pulled it out carefully, setting it on the metal table under the fluorescent lights. The lid lifted with a soft crackle, the contents inside exactly as forgotten as he expected. Photographs curled at the edges, fingerprint cards yellowed with time, typed reports brittle and worn, but it was the small envelope near the bottom that stopped him cold. A plain envelope. Brown. A handwritten word smeared slightly from age. MISC. Beaumont picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands. It weighed almost nothing, but the significance hit him like a blow. A single hair could change everything. A single hair could expose a lie the town had lived with for nearly half a century. Carefully, he opened the envelope and slid out the strand intact, protected by time, still capable of telling the truth no one had bothered to hear. He stared at it for a long moment, not out of hesitation, but out of anger. Anger for the years wasted. Anger for the pain the Ellisons endured. Anger for the negligence that allowed the person responsible to live freely. Not anymore. Beaumont secured the sample in a new protective sleeve. He labeled it properly. Then he submitted it for full DNA testing without waiting for approval. This wasn't just another case for him. This was a promise to a family, to a town, and to a woman who never got the justice she deserved. Stay with us, this is where buried truth rises. Hours later, the sample arrived at the TBI lab. Machines hummed. Technicians prepared reagents. The extraction process began. And for the first time in 45 years, the evidence finally had a chance to speak. The hair sample that sat ignored for nearly half a century was finally where it always should have been, inside a modern forensic lab, under the hands of experts who understood exactly what was at stake. Under bright white lights, the technicians handled the envelope with deliberate care, aware that a single mistake could bury the truth all over again. They placed the strand onto a sterile glass slide, examining it under magnification. Even after decades, the structure was intact. No mold. No excessive decay. The protective envelope, despite its careless label, had shielded it from moisture, sunlight, and contamination. That alone felt like a small miracle. Beaumont stood behind the observation window, arms folded tightly across his chest. He didn't speak, he didn't move, he barely blinked. He had waited his entire career for a moment like this, the moment when evidence long overlooked finally had the chance to reveal what so many people refused to see in 1973. Inside the lab, the technicians began the extraction process. The strand was treated with reagents to separate the cellular material from the outer structure. Machines hummed softly, steady, rhythmic, precise. The DNA amplification system warmed up, preparing to read genetic code locked away for decades. Every step was monitored, every result cross-checked. The atmosphere was tense, not chaotic, but filled with the silent understanding that this single strand could reopen a case the town had almost erased. Minutes felt like hours as the sample moved through each stage. Beaumont watched closely, his frustration transforming into hope. If the DNA held, if it produced a clean profile, this wouldn't just be progress, it would be the turning point. One of the technicians glanced up at him and nodded. The sample was viable. The extraction had worked. The first data had appeared on the monitor. For the first time in 45 years, Maren's case shifted from memory to action, from forgotten evidence to undeniable truth waiting to surface. When the first lines of data appeared on the monitor, the room shifted from quiet focus to sharpened anticipation. The technicians leaned closer, eyes scanning the early markers. The DNA wasn't degraded. It wasn't partial. It wasn't contaminated. Against all odds, the sample had survived 4.5 decades, with enough integrity to build a meaningful profile. Beaumont felt the tension rise behind his ribs. This was the moment that could crack open everything the town had sealed away. Minutes later, the first definitive result flashed across the screen. Male DNA. Not female. Not inconclusive. Not trace-level noise. A clear, identifiable genetic signature from a man who had no reason to be in Maren Ellison's home. Who was he, and why was his hair on Maren's coat? The technicians moved fast now, running the full profile. When the system finished its comparison against Tennessee's database, Beaumont already suspected what the outcome would be. No match. But the real shock came from the next test, the comparison against the original 1,973 suspect, Orrin Keller. The lab pulled Keller's archived DNA from past collection files and ran the samples side by side. The result was immediate and absolute. Not a match. If Keller didn't do it, why was he blamed for so long, and who benefited from pointing fingers at him? Beaumont let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Keller had lived under suspicion for decades, judged, whispered about, quietly condemned without evidence. And now, with a single test, his name was cleared completely. The real perpetrator? Still unidentified. Still unaccounted for. Still walking free, or had walked free for decades without anyone realizing it. But the DNA didn't stop there. The system generated a partial Y chromosome profile, enough to trace paternal lineage. Enough to open a new door. Enough to reveal the family the killer came from. And that discovery would change everything. Once the Y chromosome markers were confirmed, the case shifted from a stalled investigation into a laser-focused pursuit. The Y profile didn't identify one specific man, but it did point to a bloodline. A family tree. A paternal branch that could be isolated, analyzed, and traced like footprints across generations. The forensic genealogy team fed the markers into national databases. The room was silent except for the soft clicking of keys, the hum of servers searching millions of records, and the slow spread of new data across the screen. The first hit appeared within minutes, not a direct match, but a distant relative. A second hit followed, then a third. The pattern became impossible to ignore. All three belonged to men with roots in Middle Tennessee. All three connected to the same extended family. A family name that still carried weight in Nashville. What would the DNA reveal once the branches narrowed further? The team cross-referenced census records, property documents, public family trees, and birth registries. They removed the unrelated, eliminated the impossible, and tightened the circle around the line that carried the Y markers. Soon, multiple ancestral branches merged into one central knot, a single cluster of descendants spanning 2 generations. Only a handful of men fit the age range. Only a handful lived near Columbia in 1973. Only one had any connection to Maren Ellison. Why had no one questioned this man before, and who protected him from suspicion? The genealogy chart on the monitor shrank from dozens of names to 3. Then 2. Then... Beaumont leaned in as the final link connected. One name rose above all others. A name that belonged to a family respected, admired, and firmly rooted in Nashville society. The air in the room shifted. Everyone felt it. The truth wasn't just close, it was standing in front of them. Only subscribers get first alerts when cold cases break. And in that moment, the identity of the man tied to the DNA was undeniable. Beaumont whispered the name under his breath, stunned. Alistair Kincaid. When the final genealogical link appeared on the screen, Beaumont felt the room tighten around him. For a heartbeat, he wondered if the system had made a mistake, if some old record had tangled the lineage, or if the database had cross-referenced the wrong branch. But the data was clear. The matches were consistent. The markers were clean. The name at the center of the web wasn't a drifter. Not a stranger. Not a forgotten face from the margins of Columbia. It was Alistair Kincaid, a man whose name carried weight in Nashville, a man people trusted, a man woven into the local business scene for decades. Beaumont stared at the screen, jaw locked, fists clenched. Anger rose through him, slow, hot, undeniable. This wasn't just unexpected, it was outrageous. Kincaid wasn't just part of the community, he was celebrated by it. He served on committees, donated to local causes, spoke at events. People greeted him with warm handshakes and friendly admiration. The idea that he could be involved in Maren's disappearance seemed unthinkable, and that's exactly why no one ever suspected him. But Beaumont didn't rely on impressions. He checked the records again. He traced Kincaid's family line. He pulled employment documents from the 1,970 seconds, and that's when another detail snapped into place. Kincaid worked only a few blocks from Maren's apartment in 1973. His daily route took him past her building. He lived close enough to know the neighborhood intimately. The pieces weren't random. They formed a pattern the original investigators never bothered to see. Beaumont's shock slowly transformed into fury. How many times had Kincaid smiled at neighbors? How many years had he lived openly, freely, confidently? How many conversations had he shared with the very people who once searched for Maren? The realization was sickening. The man the town trusted was the same man tied to the DNA. And Beaumont wasn't going to let him hide behind that reputation any longer. Once the shock of Kincaid's name settled, Beaumont forced himself to move from disbelief to action. Respectability means nothing when the evidence points in your direction. He opened Kincaid's older records, employment files, local reports, archived logs from the early 1,970 seconds, anything that could explain how a man with such a polished reputation ended up tied to the DNA. That's when the first crack appeared in Kincaid's carefully crafted image. Buried deep in a cabinet labeled Personnel Grievances, Beaumont found a report filed in 1972, a full year before Maren vanished. It described an incident involving Kincaid and a young woman who worked at a nearby diner. She claimed he followed her after closing, grabbed her wrist, and whispered comments that made her run for help. The report was thin, handwritten, and unresolved. The woman didn't push the complaint further after her manager encouraged her to drop it for the sake of keeping things calm. Why didn't anyone connect this behavior to Maren's disappearance the following year? Beaumont dug deeper. It didn't take long to uncover more signs that Kincaid wasn't the harmless figure people believed him to be. Multiple co-workers from the early 70 seconds had described him as too friendly, too observant, or always appearing where he wasn't needed. None of these comments made it into official reports, but they lived in old interviews, indirect notes, and small mentions scattered across unrelated documents. How many warnings slipped through unnoticed because no one thought a man with a pleasant smile could be dangerous? Then came the connection Beaumont needed most. A former employee mentioned that Kincaid often lingered near the building where Maren lived, especially on evenings when local events ended. He claimed it was because Kincaid liked the walk, but Beaumont knew better. Patterns like that aren't random. Kincaid didn't blend into the background by accident. He perfected it. He used familiarity as a shield. He hid inside the town's trust. And in 1973, that trust gave him the cover he needed. With Kincaid's name now tied to the DNA, Beaumont turned his attention back to the physical evidence, specifically the boot print that had been ignored in 1973. The original photograph was grainy, poorly lit, and taken from only one angle, but the tread pattern was still clear enough to study. Beaumont sent the image to the Modern Footwear Analysis Unit, hoping they could extract more than the original investigators ever bothered to try. The response came faster than expected. Even from the old photograph, specialists identified the tread as belonging to a discontinued line of outdoor boots popular in the early 1,970 seconds. Only a handful of brands used that exact angled pattern, and one of them was known for its distinctive heel design. Beaumont dug through Kincaid's employment records, personal files, and archived belongings, and the truth hit him like a freight train. Kincaid owned those boots. Not just the brand, the exact model. A pair he purchased in 1972. A pair he was known for wearing constantly. A pair that matched the sole impression left in the dirt behind Maren's apartment. Why didn't investigators compare his boots in 1973 and who steered attention away from him? As Beaumont matched the tread pattern to the old photo, the evidence aligned with precision. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't coincidence. It was a direct link the original department never explored. How many years did Kincaid walk freely while this quiet truth lay ignored in a storage box? Beaumont cross-referenced Kincaid's stated alibi from 1973. It was flimsy, vague, and built entirely on the word of two co-workers, both of whom admitted decades later that they barely remembered that night and only vouched for him because he seemed trustworthy. Trustworthy? That was the armor he wore for 50 years. Now, the armor was cracking. This twist blindsided investigators. Subscribe if it blindsided you too. Beaumont gathered the bootprint analysis, the DNA results, and Kincaid's history into a single case file. It was time. Detectives prepared for the arrest. The truth was no longer hiding, and neither was Kincaid. The morning of the arrest began like any other in downtown Nashville, sunlight cutting across City Hall, workers shuffling in with coffee, security guards exchanging bored greetings. But the detectives stationed across the street weren't there for routine. They weren't there for paperwork or meetings. They were there for Alistair Kincaid. Beaumont sat in an unmarked car, eyes locked on the building's front doors. His jaw tightened every time someone walked out. Every passing minute stretched thin with tension. The air felt heavy in the car, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Kincaid had no idea the world he built was seconds from collapse. At 8:43 a.m., the doors opened, and Kincaid stepped outside, adjusting the sleeves of his neatly pressed jacket. Calm, collected, the same polished demeanor the community had admired for decades. He carried himself like a man who expected the day to unfold without complication. But Beaumont's team moved fast. Plainclothes officers approached from both sides. One called his name. Kincaid turned, confused at first, then visibly unsettled as he recognized the badges. His smile faltered. His posture stiffened. The mask he'd worn for 50 years flickered for the first time. "Alistair Kincaid," the lead detective announced. "You're under arrest." Gasps erupted from the growing crowd. Phones rose into the air. Office workers froze mid-step. Some whispered in disbelief. Others stood rooted to the ground, struggling to process what they were seeing. This wasn't a stranger being handcuffed. This wasn't a drifter or an outsider. This was a man they trusted, a man they respected, a man who had shaken hands with half the city. Kincaid tried to speak a protest, a denial, something, but his voice cracked before the words formed. His hands trembled as officers secured the cuffs. He looked around, searching for a familiar face to reach for, but the crowd only stared back in stunned silence. In that moment, Nashville didn't just witness an arrest. It watched a legacy crumble. The door to the interrogation room shut with a quiet click, but inside, the tension was anything but quiet. Kincaid sat at the metal table, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the wall as if he could will himself somewhere else. The confidence he wore in public had thinned. His shoulders were tight, his breathing uneven. For the first time in decades, he didn't control the room. Beaumont entered with a case file thick enough to speak for itself. He didn't shout, he didn't posture. He simply laid the file on the table and let its weight settle between them. "Alistair," he began calmly, "we're past the point of pretending." Kincaid tried to hold a steady expression, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. He cleared his throat, attempted a faint smile, and asked, "Is this really necessary?" Beaumont opened the file. First page, the DNA report. Second page, the footwear analysis. Third, the old harassment complaint. Fourth, statements linking him to Maren's neighborhood. With each page turned, Kincaid's composure thinned further. If he truly had nothing to hide, why did the evidence make him flinch like every page burned him? Beaumont leaned forward. 50 years is a long time, long enough for people to forget mistakes. But you didn't make a mistake, Alistair. You made choices. Choices with consequences. Kincaid rubbed his palms together, his nerves now visible. "You're twisting things," he muttered. "You don't understand." But the confidence wasn't there. The tone lacked conviction. The words trembled on the edge of collapse. Why did a man who spent his life controlling every interaction suddenly sound unsure of his own story? Beaumont placed the boot print comparison photo in front of him and tapped the page gently. "Tell me why your shoes were there." Kincaid's breath caught sharp, unsteady. The mask wasn't slipping anymore. It was breaking. Kincaid sat frozen, eyes locked on the boot print comparison. His fingers trembled against the metal table, and his breathing turned shallow. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were pushing him toward the truth he'd buried for half a century. Beaumont didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the evidence speak. "You were there," he said quietly. "You walked behind her. You followed her home." A long, suffocating silence filled the room. Kincaid's jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck tightened. His eyes darted between the photo and Beaumont, searching for a lie to cling to, but there were no lies left that could survive the weight of the evidence stacked in front of him. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he whispered, voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Those words hit the room like a hammer. Beaumont kept his focus sharp. "Tell me what happened, Alistair." Kincaid swallowed hard. Tears gathered, but they weren't tears of remorse, more like a dam breaking after decades of pressure. His voice wavered as he spoke. "I followed her from the reading. I just wanted to talk. She got scared. She tried to run. I grabbed her. She fell. After that, I panicked. I didn't think anyone would believe me. So I hid her. I hid her where no one would ever look." How many years did this confession sit just beneath his polished smile, waiting to crack? Kincaid's confession didn't just expose guilt, it exposed the lie he had lived as. Beaumont leaned in. "Where is she, Alistair?" Kincaid closed his eyes, defeated. "I buried her," he whispered, "in the woods on my family's old property near the ridge." The truth wasn't whispered into the world. It was dragged out of a man who spent 50 years pretending to be harmless. What shocked you most, the crime or the disguise? Comment below. And now, the search for Maren could finally begin. The search team moved through the woods with a level of focus that carried the weight of 5 decades. Every step felt deliberate, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally come looking in the right place. Beaumont stood near the ridge Kincaid described, scanning the ground as the forensic team fanned out, careful not to disturb anything fragile. It didn't take long. A quiet call from one of the technicians cut through the stillness. The tone wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Beaumont felt the message instantly. He walked toward the small clearing where the soil had shifted just enough to reveal what time could not erase. The team uncovered fragments first. Pieces of clothing. A remnant of jewelry. The kind of details that force everyone present to confront the human story buried under decades of silence. No one spoke for a long moment. The forest seemed to press in around them, not in menace, but in sorrow, as if it had been carrying the secret alone for far too long. Why did it take a new generation to correct the failure that silenced Maren's truth for half a century? Beaumont radioed for the coroner, though he already knew what they had found. There was no uncertainty left. The case that had gone quiet in 1973 was no longer a mystery hidden in forgotten files. It was now a recovered reality, painful, unmistakable, undeniable. When the call to the Ellison family was made, the weight of the moment settled on everyone involved. Maren's sister, older now and worn by years of unanswered questions, didn't speak at first. She simply breathed in sharply, as if her entire life had just shifted into a new shape, one with answers she never thought she'd receive. After 50 years, Maren was coming home. Not because the town remembered, not because the system redeemed itself, but because truth, once uncovered, refuses to be ignored. The Ellison family gathered at the small chapel reserved for them, moving slowly, cautiously, as if a single misstep might shatter what little strength they had left. 50 years is long enough to change a person twice over, long enough for hope to harden into resignation, and resignation to settle into quiet survival. Yet standing before the casket that held what remained of Maren, every buried feeling rose to the surface again. Her sister Valerie placed a hand on the polished wood. She didn't cry at first. The tears came later. What arrived now was anger, the kind of anger that grows roots. The kind that forms when a life is carved in half by someone else's choices. "We waited for you," she whispered. We never stopped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the voice of a woman who learned to live in the shadow of a question that had stolen her future. A question that should have been answered in 1973. The town, once eager to forget, now had to face what it allowed. The people who once whispered excuses now whispered guilt. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid the Ellisons now sent flowers, unsure whether they were offering comfort or atonement. How different would everything be if anyone had spoken up sooner? As the service ended, Beaumont stepped outside, letting the family have their moment. The air felt heavier than before, as if the cost of 50 years was finally being counted. And here is where the truth lands hardest. This didn't happen because danger was invisible. It happened because people trusted the wrong face. If stories like this remind you how easily danger hides in plain sight, don't leave yourself unprepared. Subscribe now so you're never the last to know when justice finally breaks through. And if you choose not to, tell us why in the comments. Every reason matters. The town could never return to what it was. Certain truths permanently reshape a place. When the truth finally reached the public, Nashville felt the shock in waves. Not because the crime was unknown, but because the wrong man carried the stain for nearly 50 years. Orrin Keller, once stamped as the town's favorite suspect, had lived under a cloud he never earned. His reputation, his opportunities, his dignity all eroded by silence and assumption. Beaumont made sure the updated statement cleared Keller's name in full. He didn't deserve an apology whispered in private. He deserved vindication spoken loud enough to erase 5 decades of whispered blame. The report went public, and for the first time in years, Keller's family felt the weight lifting off their shoulders. The town gathered in the square that week, some to grieve, some to understand, many to confront their own past. Everything felt different now. Kincaid's arrest had forced them to rethink every judgment they'd ever made about who looks dangerous, who looks safe, and how easily comfort blinds a community. The story wasn't just about a crime. It was about how trust, unchecked, becomes a blindfold. Standing at Maren's memorial, Beaumont reflected on the entire journey. Every mistake from 1973. Every moment the town chose convenience over truth. Every year Maren's family waited for a voice willing to challenge the old narrative. Now the lesson was carved into Nashville's memory. Evil doesn't need shadows. It thrives in places where no one questions the familiar. And that is why stories like Maren's matter, because forgetting them is how history repeats itself. Subscribe so stories like Maren's never stay buried again. Stay aware. Stay informed. And if you're choosing not to subscribe, tell us why in the comments. Your reason might help us understand what you need. The camera would fade out on Maren's memorial, quiet, steady, and finally at peace. But the message stays. Truth only survives when someone refuses to stop searching.